What is up, everybody? This is Matt from Matt Media, and welcome to the first episode of Film Retrospective. And this is where I take a movie, whether it be standalone or a full film series, and I take a look back on it, considering everything from their impact on the film industry to its critical and public reception, and in certain elements as to why the film was either good or bad. Two rules to this series: the movie should be relatively mainstream, and the movie can't be too recent. So it should be roughly 5 years or older. So don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and without further ado, let's get to a highly acclaimed fantasy series, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. I was going to do the Hobbit films as well, but I decided to leave that to another video. There's a lot to say about the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and the video is going to end up very, very long. Longer than it already is. Longer than it's already gonna be. Released between 2001 and 2003, the Lord of the Rings trilogy set the standard for modern fantasy filmmaking. Since their release, nearly every movie of the fantasy genre was made on the model set by the Lord of the Rings, and that includes The Hobbit, Jackson's other trilogy of films. The Lord of the Rings trilogy was released to widespread critical acclaim, inspiring a devoted fan base and kicking off a full media franchise which includes video games, toys, clothing, cosplay, and even a line of Funko Pops. The film even got recognition in awards season. The third film, The Return of the King, not only was the first fantasy film in Academy Award history to win both Best Picture and Best Director, but the film currently holds the record for the biggest clean sweep of the Oscars, winning all 11 of its nominations. Now that I've set up this great trilogy of films, let's look back at these pieces of work and why they're looked at with such reverence. One of the secrets behind a great movie is a great story, and the Lord of the Rings trilogy knew how to tell a story with incredible effectiveness. Being an adaptation, obviously there are parts of the books that need to be taken out or changed to make it more effective as a film instead of a book. And with books that average at least 350 to 400 pages long, you definitely need to cut some things. Now, while some adaptations don't do the best job of cutting and changing source material, either cutting things out that were more important or changing things that just didn't make sense, I think The Lord of the Rings does it quite well. Scenes that were kept from book to film were all necessary to move the story forward, and some characters were combined with other characters to not overload the film. For example, in the Fellowship of the Ring movie, Arwen takes Frodo to Rivendell after he's stabbed at Weathertop. However, in the book, a completely different elf character, Glorfindel, is the one who does this. Because Glorfindel's character is such a minor role in the overall arching story of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, his character was cut and Arwen took that role. Also, Glorfindel is such an important character in the whole of Tolkien lore. Giving him such a small role in this movie would be such an undermining of his character. I mean, look it up. Glorfindel is like the coolest elf character in all of Tolkien lore. Other characters cut in the film include Tom Bombadil, Erkenbrand, and Elrond's twin sons, Eladan and Elrohir. And like I said earlier, for the films to not be overloaded with characters, these ones were cut out so the story can flow better without too many tangents. Now, while seeing Tom Bombadil in live action form would have been really cool, his part in the book is more like a side plot to the Hobbits' journey and doesn't really play a role in the journey as a whole. I mean, Tom Bombadil is the one who gives the Hobbits their knives, but in the movie, Aragorn does that, and that works out just fine. Each of these movies are almost 3 hours long. The extended editions are 4 hours long. We don't need side plots. Overall, I think the biggest strength of the Lord of the Rings trilogy is its storytelling. And considering it's an adaptation of a long series of books, that's pretty impressive. A bad or subpar movie will take various character archetypes, but just leave them as basic characters. What makes the Lord of the Rings trilogy great movies is how it embodies those archetypes, but adds more elements to flesh them out. A lot of the characters weave through different archetypes throughout the story, and there isn't just one hero, there isn't just one sage character, and there isn't just one antagonist. All four hobbits, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, can all be seen as heroes at various times. Or, because of their position as hobbits in the big world of Middle-earth, they're also seen as kind of misfit, fish-out-of-water characters.
It's all wrong. By rights, we shouldn't even be here.
Gandalf is, of course, the sage character, as he's the one who sets Frodo off on his journey and provides wisdom and advice along the way. And he also does his fair share of heroics as well.
You shall not pass!
Now, Aragorn is a hero character, but he's also been a guide and a wise exposition sage character as well. I mean, he's been more often a hero character, and even a hero with some sort of preordained destiny. Aragorn is what is called a Dunedain, which is a special race of men descended from the men of Númenor, the original kings of Gondor and Arnor. He's destined in the end to become king and reunite those kingdoms, and does so at the end of the Return of the King. But that's still not everything, because initially Aragorn is a reluctant hero. At the start of the films, he spurns his destiny and chooses a life as a ranger, like other Dunedain decided to do at the time. Now, I still think the characters is a big part as to why these movies are so good. However, I don't think it's as strong an element as the story, because while a lot of characters got fleshed out, a lot of them were heavily simplified. Now, the characters Legolas and Gimli started off as promising characters. However, they each ended up inhabiting one single character trait. Gimli ended up being the team clown, and Legolas was on cheat codes. Not too many people talk about this, but Legolas is the most overpowered character in the whole film series. The kinds of things he does at times, while cool, it's just ridiculous. He surfs downstairs on shields, vaults himself onto horses, and even single-handedly takes down an Oliphant.
That still only counts as one.
Seriously, another character that I think's been kind of unfortunate is Denethor. If you only watched the Return of the King film, I can understand why you might dislike Denethor, but his characterization in the film is such an undermining of his real character, because his character history portrays him as a grief-struck man, but was still strong-willed, wise, and learned. But the film turned him into a cowardly, weak, and even incompetent leader. While it's unfortunate, I can understand why they simplified Denethor. His backstory is a little deep to portray in a single movie, especially one that was already long enough, so Peter Jackson simplified the character. In the J.R.R. Tolkien Encyclopedia, Daniel Timmons writes that Jackson, through Denethor, dramatizes the insidious temptation of evil, and that through the falls of Saruman, Denethor, and Sauron, we see the bitter fruits of the lust for power and its corrupting influence. Now, the last character I want to get to is Saruman. For a character who is supposedly the antagonist of the second film, he sure has a very limited appearance in the last film, in the sense that he's not in it at all. Now, if you only watch the theatrical version of The Return of the King, you'll notice that Saruman completely disappears. I mean, next to Sauron, Saruman is probably the biggest villain in the entire films, even more so than Sauron, because he's at least figuratively there. I mean, luckily, if you've seen the extended edition, you can see what actually happens to Saruman, and it happens in the beginning of the film. I mean, but still, for a character who was supposedly one of the biggest villains of the whole trilogy, it would have been nice to have his last moments be in the theatrical release as well. Now, as great as the Lord of the Rings trilogy is, it still isn't without its problems. I'll keep these fairly brief because most of the issues I have with the films are pretty much well known because it's everybody's problem with the films. Let's start with the big one, the tease endings. When I first saw these in the theaters, it was ridiculous how many people kept getting faked out by the endings. I mean, every time it blacked out, we thought the movie was over. But then it kept going. I mean, I get that there's a lot to wrap up, but did you have to make them all look like a final ending? I mean, the endings themselves were actually pretty good and probably the best way to end everybody's stories, but the fake outs were a bit much. The next problem is one I'm sure everybody's familiar with, the Eagles. Again, I'm not going to go into these too much because they're well documented, but the Eagles are the most talked about plot hole in the whole series. I mean, they just seem to show up conveniently at opportune times, but I mean, everybody just keeps asking, why can't the Fellowship just ride the Eagles all the way to Mount Doom? Or at least get them close to it so they don't have to walk the entire way. I mean, I don't know. I mean, this plot hole's been pointed out so often, but I still had to point it out because with so few problems, you gotta point out the obvious ones. Even with those problems, it's still a great trilogy of films. The story is well crafted, the characters are timeless and iconic, and it set the standard for not just book to film adaptations, but for fantasy and sci-fi filmmaking as well. All things considered, it's a remarkable achievement. Well, that's all I have to cover in this retrospective for the Lord of the Rings film trilogy. So what did you think of the Lord of the Rings film trilogy? Do you have your own thoughts on why it's as good or not as good as I think it is? Leave your comments below, while you like and subscribe. But until next time, have a kick-ass day, and I'll see you later.